So, about 90% of Canadians marry at least once, but marriage is becoming less important for many Canadians. Even in 1995, when asked, in order for you to be happy in life, is it very important? Important, not very important, or not at all important to be married? Just two-thirds of Canadian women rated marriage as important or very important. Younger Canadians were less likely than older Canadians to consider marriage important or very important. Those living in Quebec were markedly less likely to do so. 53% of women and 53% of men in Quebec considered marriage important or very important. And although living in a common law relationship may be a prelude to marriage for some people, for others it has become an alternative to marriage. Since the Canadian census first started collecting information on cohabitation in 1981, the number of cohabitating people 15 years of age and older has increased dramatically. The proportion of common law families in Canada nearly quadrupled between 1981 and 2016, from 5.6% to 21% of all families. In Quebec, the 2016 figure was 39.8%. Majority of women outside Quebec and three-quarters of women in Quebec believe it is acceptable for couples to live together when they have no intention of making a long-term commitment and are simply sexually attracted to each other. Younger women in Quebec are particularly likely to voice such approval. So these attitudes also change if we get to Toronto. So I was raised in Toronto. I live in Toronto, and in Toronto, Toronto has one of the highest rates of divorce in Canada, and the average person in Toronto is 35 to 38 years old, and the average person actually marries after the age of 30, and many people in Toronto have one or two children. Toronto also has one of the highest gay, lesbian, and transgender populations in Canada, and openly gay, lesbian, transgender populations in Canada. And also, Toronto, I think, has the highest rate of gay marriage. So many people in Toronto often. The problem is with collecting statistics is a lot of people decline to participate in these studies because it is also the place which has the highest it has some of the highest housing prices and also the financial district. It is also one of the most consumer-driven cities. So there are a lot of different research studies. So when we look at the Brim book, these kind of statistics, I think, are often used to tell a story about Canada, but I would argue that there are lots of stories that that are not really counted in statistics. Stories of forced marriage are often not included in these statistics. So when Canadians are asked, for example, about their attitudes towards marriage, do we all understand marriage to be the same? And many Canadians who have experienced or understanding of a forced marriage system in, say, South Asia or Iran, the Middle East, anywhere in the global South, might understand marriage to actually be a form of human slavery. So Maria Malik wrote an article in Toronto Life in 2022 about being forced to marry by her parents at the age of 17. Malik writes, "All I ever wanted was to be a normal Toronto teenager, but when I was 17, my parents brought me to Pakistan and married me off to my cousin." And Malik escaped the forced marriage and went back to Canada, and so Malik was born in Pakistan in 1987, and her father had these scarce, low-paying jobs, and he moved to Canada to try to make more money. Um, so when she was 5 months old, he got a job at a men's clothing factory in Montreal. 4 years later, he sponsored his wife and his daughter to join him. However, in Pakistan, he knew of young men who wanted to marry Muslim women, so he did try to arrange his daughter's marriage at 17. So, despite the fact that she was born in Canada, she was sent to Pakistan as a teenager to marry someone against her will. Um, Maria Malik did escape and return to Canada. So, what she describes is how her parents actually became extremely abusive as she aged. So, as a child, she was Canadian and she went to a Canadian school. She also describes how her parents never had enough money to live in Canada and would not work properly and would not use Canada's facilities properly. As she got older, they became more and more abusive and then tried to move her to Pakistan. There have been many instances of honor-related violence against Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim women who are born in Canada. And they are Canadian girls and Canadian women, sometimes who are forced to marry people in India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka against their will. And these forced relationships often allow their parents, who are immigrants, to make money. Sometimes the forced relationships are also about the sense of aggression that these people have against Canadian women and girls and against Canadian English-speaking women and girls, like their own daughters. So what we think of as marriage and family is obviously dependent on our relationship of these formations and what they actually mean in relation to the law, and what they actually mean in relation to basic human rights. So during the first half of the 20th century, Robert Brim discusses how lone parent families were generally the result of the death of one parent. Today, solo parenting is usually the product of separation or divorce, after which child custody is typically granted to mothers. In 2016, more than 13% of Canadian families were headed by a lone parent, and more than 80% of those families were headed by women. So, divorce laws have changed considerably in our time period. And while divorce is still actually considered to be really culturally taboo or a really big deal in many parts of the world, divorce is actually quite normalized, and it has been legal for so many decades in Canada. So before 1968, adultery was the only grounds for divorce in Canada, except in Nova Scotia, where cruelty was sufficient grounds, even before Confederation. The Divorce Act of 1968, the first federal divorce statute, expanded the grounds under which a divorce could be granted. The amendment of Canada's Divorce Act in 1985 allowed only for one ground for divorce, marital breakdown, defined in three ways. The spouses have lived apart for 1 year. One of the spouses has committed an act of adultery. One spouse has treated the other with mental or physical cruelty. Today, a spouse seeking divorce no longer has to prove grounds. Instead, a marriage is legally dissolved because the relationship is said to be irretrievably broken. And that's all that really needs to be said. Following these amendments, the divorce rate reached a historic high in 1987, but has since declined. Some 41% of Canadian marriages now end in divorce. So, women's income usually falls after divorce, while men's income generally stays the same. That is because husbands tend to earn more than wives do. Children typically live with their mothers after divorce, and child support payments are often inadequate. In the past, Canadian laws regarding the division of marital assets on divorce and the awarding of alimony contributed to women's declining living standards after divorce. For example, in the early 1970s, Irene Murdoch, a farm wife, claimed that her labor over 15 years had earned her a share of the family's farm. However, the Supreme Court Canada ruled that her work was simply that of an ordinary farm wife and did not entitle her to share in the property that she and her husband had accumulated during their marriage. So these disputes regarding property and marriage are central to our time period in Canada, that disputes regarding who owes who money and who should support one financially after divorce are central to divorce law. The case of Maria Malik is also a really interesting one, and there will be more and more of these cases in the media and Canadian courts of law. And these debates regarding religious freedom among immigrants and among immigrant families must be balanced with the rights of children and the rights of women and the rights of all persons to consent, or of course to not, no, to say no, 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 to say no to religious marriage and what would be termed forced marriage. So, how does the structure of inequality between privileged groups seeking to maintain their advantages and subordinate groups seeking to increase theirs lead to conflict and often to social change? When we think about what the family is in conflict theory, we have to think about it also in relation to gender and how it's possible to seize upon the gendered body and to throw one into even the flames of like ethnic wars in the global south because of one's gender. According to conflict theorists, rising demand for women to pursue a higher education and enter the paid labor force, together with the availability of contraception, child care services, and reproduction outside the nuclear family, have altered the traditional division of labor between husband and wife, and more generally, power relations between women and men. So the possibility that someone could be an independent earner and the possibility that gender would not mean that one would be dependent financially on another person changes the structure of the family. It also changes this kind of relationship where someone who is old can objectify the body of someone who is young. So the kind of "you're pretty" economy once used to be really about the male breadwinner who had more money than the woman and would say, "You're young, you're pretty, I'll take care of you, then you could have children and I'll take care of them." But if one has more money than someone, then why would they really care? Why would someone really need this kind of attention? And why would people even need to really have children? This kind of question has made the family one of the most contentious issues in our time. The US election was full of all of these really kind of fantastical rants by this person, J.D. Vance, who is the Vice President of the United States of America. And J.D. Vance thinks that women who don't have multiple children and will not use all their disposable income to help, I guess, hillbillies and their children are all a threat to the American way of life. Like this kind of great fear of women who are middle class and rich and will not support and will actually compete for jobs and will get lawyers to sue entire companies or industries if they are not successful, is the kind of fear. The fear is also obviously of people who don't want to be molested by Harvey Weinstein and who will again use the law and social movements to protest. And so this kind of gender division of labor and the dissolution of a gendered division of labor is what really threatens people who would like to be given things because of their gender. How do social conventions maintain male dominance and female subordination? And how do these conventions get overturned? Like conflict theorists, feminist theorists highlight change in power relations between women and men as the driving force behind change in family structures. However, unlike Marxist-inspired conflict theorists, most feminist theorists think these changes have less to do with class relations than with gender revolution and patriarchy that has been taking place since 1960s. So while Marxists would argue that the family is less central to people's lives because we can all compete for jobs and we don't need to be dependent on parents or on husbands, and when we all compete for jobs, perhaps we will be offered a great offer of employment in a great city far away from the place that we were from. And if we are offered this job, perhaps the family will be less important than our own success. And so the family, from a Marxist perspective, is also really not necessarily convenient because we can all sell our labor all around the world. From a feminist perspective, what threatens the family is consciousness raising. So in the 1960s and 1970s, the American feminist movement had a whole series of groups of consciousness raising where women who were being beaten or neglected or abused or treated badly or who were doing an extensive amount of unpaid labor in the home, all kind of met each other and became part of the second wave of the feminist movement. And this was after the first wave, which granted all persons, including women, the right to vote. So the second wave of the feminist movement then perhaps made people cautious about domestic violence and about child abuse. There were a whole series of films like The Burning Bed, which starred this woman, Farrah Fawcett, and her husband actually set fire to her in the bed. There were movies like Thelma and Louise, where these two women had to kind of run across America to escape an abusive man. So the family, I think, became really a contentious issue because there were many people who documented having been abused. Money was also really central in these debates about the family. Many people who joined a family or were part of a family really did feel that someone had stolen their hard-earned money and was living off them. Children and child abuse, including child sexual abuse, and specifically the sexual abuse of daughters by their fathers or uncles, was central to this demystification of the family. The use of the family in mobs, and the use of the family in gangs, and the use of the family to traffic young girls across borders for the purpose of sex work was also one of the reasons that the family kind of became somewhat unfashionable to discuss without context. Although all Canadian provinces and territories now have laws requiring spouses to share assets in the event of marital breakdown, the precise definition of what constitutes a family asset varies and creates inconsistencies across jurisdictions. In addition, although the monetary value of tangible family assets such as money in the bank or a house can be calculated and shared, the valuable new property today is the earning power of a professional degree, highly paid employment, work experience, a skilled trade, or other human capital. On divorce, the wife may receive an equal share of tangible property, but that does not usually result in her beginning post-divorce life on an equal footing with her former husband, especially if she retains physical custody of the couple's children and if she sacrificed her education and career so that he could earn a college or university degree. So, the unfortunate truth that Robert Brim documents in this time in Canada is that women often lose a lot of economic opportunity and even money because of marriage. And then in divorce, women will then lose more money. So, many women have the capacity to earn a great deal of money, and they have a capacity to earn a great deal of money at a young age. But if someone marries, specifically the case that is common in, say, Ontario, where I'm from, is that women who are from these very rural towns outside of Toronto will not do any higher education. They will not even come to the city of Toronto, which has a really strong financial district and a lot of corporate law and a lot of job opportunities. They will marry in these rural towns and they will support a man's career. When they are divorced, they will have even less money and they will have no capacity to sell their labor. So there are lots of stories in Toronto of people who are hairdressers at a later age or who work in the service industry, bartenders you can meet are women from these rural towns who are divorced. One of the reasons that they are obviously divorced is because of spousal abuse, domestic violence, also extramarital affairs. So, because of the privileging of kind of the male breadwinner and the woman who stays at home, female beauty is often privileged in heterosexual cisgender relationships. Youth is often privileged. From a biological perspective and a physiological perspective, this is because of the birth of children. But this has also become this kind of, I guess, fetish or trope within heterosexual culture that men choose women whom they find to be young and pretty and try to have relationships with them. These relationships could end in marriage, but they could also end in men finding more young, pretty women to have more relationships with and more children with, which is typical of Ontario. And so when women get to a certain age, they might not be desirable anymore, and they could end up being single mothers, and they could end up being people who can't sell or people have problems selling their labor. So this is typical actually in the city of Toronto that many marriages end at a certain age when the male partner can find another younger woman and have another family or have another girlfriend or partner. Um, so I would argue that this kind of structure then and the kind of precarity of the possibility of marriage and then divorce is one of the reasons that marriage is often called into question, or every generation of young people and specifically young women are often kind of scared or fearful of marriage. This is also because of domestic violence and physical abuse. So child support is money paid by the non-custodial parent to the custodial parent to support the children of a separated marital, cohabitating, or sexual relationship. Under the Divorce Act, either parent can be ordered to pay child support. However, because mothers retain custody in the great majority of cases and because women are more likely to be economically disadvantaged in employment, those ordered to pay child support are usually the fathers. Every jurisdiction in Canada requires parents to support their children following separation or divorce. However, court orders do not guarantee that child support will be paid. In practice, orders for child and spousal support have often been difficult to enforce, and default rates have been high. All Canadian provinces and territories now have their own programs to protect against non-payment of child support. Nonetheless, the problem of deadbeat parents, especially fathers, remains serious. And this problem of deadbeat fathers could also be connected to urbanism. And it's interesting to think about the geography of the family and the geography of the single person who is divorced. So you can meet people, specifically in big cities like New York and London, England, who were once married, and they know that they can move to these cities and meet younger women. And it is specifically men who often will have a great deal of success if they have enough capital or financial capital that they can meet younger women in big cities where people are less likely to care about having a large family. Um, so this kind of moving economy is also about then not paying child support, and it's really difficult to track people when they leave. So then this comes to the rights of the child. There are lots of debates that could be had about the morality of not having a family or having a family. There are lots of debates that could be had about this economy of men choosing women who are young and attractive and then having the capacity to meet other people, predominantly to meet other young women and have new children with them and a new family. Like all of this can be debated. I guess the morality or religiosity or the religious virtue of having a family itself could be debated. But child rights, I think, are really interesting because child rights are now at the forefront of international law. And child rights often cannot be debated. That the the capacity for children to starve or to die or to be precariously housed or to be mentally or sexually or physically abused cannot be debated. I mean, if there is a capacity that the child will die, then it doesn't matter what kind of family you have or who your parents are. It really doesn't matter what the situation is. Children have rights independent of all of these unions that adults create and that fall apart. Children have rights that are not the rights of men, and they're not the rights of people who love men. And children have rights that are not the rights of um, gay celebrity or lesbian celebrity parents. So Canada signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1990 and ratified it in 1991. Article 19 of the Convention identifies the protection against abuse and neglect as a basic right of children. This encompasses all forms of abuse, including physical, sexual, and emotional, as well as the neglect of children. So the rights of children in Canada are specifically sensitive, and they're at the forefront of our national debates because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and because of the long history of child physical and sexual abuse and the killing of children in forced residential schooling by Jesuit missionaries and priests, and specifically by Christians and Catholics who did kidnap children from their parents and kidnap Indigenous children from their parents and force them into these English language missionary run schools. So the rights of children are central to Canadian politics now. And there are also some of the most contentious debates that are had between Indigenous people and settlers and between what might be termed the left wing and the right wing. So international children's rights, like Article 19, covers all kinds of interventions in all sectors. Other articles that expand on this general article are Article 34 on the right to protection from child abuse and exploitation. So the United Nations has put children's rights at the forefront of debates regarding the family. And there are lots of children's rights activists in the United Kingdom too who have discussed money extensively and the refusal to pay child support when or if one is no longer in a marital relationship or relationship of cohabitation. Um, the rights of children to be free from addiction and to be free from harm are also central to the rights of children. So, Article 34 on the right to protection from sexual abuse and exploitation, including child prostitution and child pornography, it is also a central issue in the rights of children in Canada. That exploitation, especially using the internet, is prohibited. Um, Child abduction and the traffic of children for the purposes of labor and also sex is obviously prohibited. And there are lots of issues with international law because of the trafficking of children across borders for the purposes of sex and sex work. And Canada also has a long history of the forced sexualization and the rape of minors and particularly young Indigenous children. So the Convention on the Rights of Children also provides for children's rights in the areas of youth justice so that young offenders are dealt with differently from adults when they are accused or convicted of crimes. Other pillars of the Convention call for recognition of children's rights to express their views and to be heard, as well as to have time and places for leisure activities. So this research describes how Canada has sought to implement the mandates of this Convention on the Rights of the Child and encourages other countries to act accordingly. So there has been this extensive research in the United States of America regarding child sexual abuse in the clergy and the use of religion to constantly discuss the family as a site of morality or as a moral project ignores this entire history. And it is really tactical, and it is what academics would refer to as polemics. So when people want to win an election, they often engage in these polemics. When they want to kind of make arguments that you would see on, say, a talk show. So if you want to kind of win an argument, you will engage in polemics that are about the goodness of, say, the family and the Christian family. The problem is they're obviously good. I mean, obviously many people are not violent or abusive in the same way that many people will live in Canada in their entire life and not experience any violence or labor exploitation. Yes, that is true. But the history of child sexual abuse by the clergy is something that has been documented, and it is really dependent on the class position that you have. So if you look at Ireland, I mean, if you were to go to a city like Dublin, it is a very modern city. It is really, there are lots of nice art galleries. They're really beautiful libraries. It is a really modern city, but there are parts of rural Ireland that are so underdeveloped that the church ends up playing a central role in people's lives. There's nothing to really do. People go to the church because it offers them something to do. The church also offers free things to people, like free meals, or it offers people a warm place. And so the church is also, however, known for scandals of child sexual abuse. And this is also true in the United States of America. So what this study argues is that children have been sexually abused in the United States of America across faith groups. So depending on the state you live in, when you look at the research about really Christian states, other people are also really kind of zealots, or I guess religious. So if you were to think about going to a Christian state, sometimes there are other really religious people like Hindus and Muslims who will also flock to these places because they know that they can have a religious family. And it's interesting to think that there isn't, say, conversion. There is just pluralism. And so what this means is that in a really Christian state, you might have people who practiced about Islam. So there have been then numerous cases across a range of faith communities in which children have been sexually abused by clergy. To prosecute these cases successfully, prosecutors must understand the unique form of grooming employed by many clergy offenders. The use of religion to get a victim to submit to abuse or to remain silent in its aftermath, and the short and long-term spiritual impact of maltreatment. So the prosecutor might not understand also that the entire congregation is against the child. It is possible that women have made a significant amount of money by marrying old pedophiles and by involving themselves in religious communities with older pedophiles, and their financial dependence is what keeps them silent and causes them to often be angry at children, especially their own daughters, who tell the truth about rape. And again, this goes back to what Robert Grimm is saying, that when women want to obtain their own money and their own education, they will not be financially dependent. And it is only often then, I mean, if we look at the research, we have to ask, who are these people and who are these people who would hide child abuse? And it is often a lack of education, a lack of capital that would cause someone to be so dependent on the family and on a whole structure of religious families that they would hide child sexual abuse. There are also cultural factors. Many people do not think that the rape of young girls by the clergy is actually a serious issue because they believe that young girls will marry, and the only thing that really matters in your life is if you marry. So even if you were abused to the point that you are severely psychologically damaged or have a great deal of trauma or to your body, as long as you get married and have children, this does not matter. The law is really clear that it does. No marriage and no childbirth and no official title or name will change the fact that child sexual abuse and child physical abuse is against the law. It is also against any basic sense of modern understanding of medicine, that it is likely that if children are sexually abused at a young age, they can develop cervical cancer and prostate cancer, and they could actually die. And they could die a really painful and like a horrible death. So I'll finish the lecture by discussing Andrea Dworkin. Andrea Dworkin was an amazing radical feminist author whose writings I think are really important when we consider the family. The family obviously then has a lot of advocates, because one of the things that conflict theorists would also say, and also symbolic interactionism and functionalism is also discussed in the book by Grimm, but conflict theorists who are interested in Marxism would argue that the family often provides people financial support if they cannot find a job. So the working class family and the immigrant family and the transnational family often supports people's immigration, supports people's lives with capital and with housing in ways that might not be possible for those who are not rich, or for people who don't have the kind of educational qualifications that would allow them to obtain a high-paid job. So the family obviously has a lot of practical benefits. And the family itself, as a way of organizing one's social life and aging, is obviously important. So when one gets to a certain age, it might be difficult to meet new people. And so having a family also provides mental and psychological support, and it provides a sense of friendship and sociality. It's also about sex and sexual desire, that when one um, is young, they can fall in love and they can have the same sexual partner, which could mitigate potentially contracting STDs if both partners are honest about their practices. The family obviously has a lot of practical benefits. However, the family has always been critiqued by feminist authors, and specifically feminist authors who are interested in the relationship between um, media, between between media and relationships and American culture and rape. So, Andrea Dworkin was an American radical feminist writer and activist. And firstly, Dworkin was known for her writings about pornography. And Dworkin argued that pornography glorifies rape against women. Andrea Dworkin was also interested, however, in the ways that glorifying and normalizing rape as pornography also turns heterosexual sex into rape. And so that if the family, and if being a mother, and if being a heterosexual mother, and being a cisgender heterosexual mother is more important than anything that one does in one's life, then does this mean that people will normalize sexual harassment and rape? Date rape is a good example. Literature regarding date rape and media coverage regarding date rape often presents us with extremely different views about rape, and this is also true of child sexual abuse. That the obsession with, or I would say that this obsession, but the interest or the ongoing, say, unrelenting interest in heterosexual families could perhaps lead one to think that sexual harassment and rape are normal, or even something that we will not call sexual harassment or rape as long as they end in a family. So India is one of the most extreme examples. India is a country where marital rape is legal. So it is legal to rape your wife in India, and it is because of the marriage system. So because of the arranged marriage system, and because of the centrality of having children, a man cannot rape his wife. There have been some really disturbing instances where a family has drugged their daughter and forcibly given her drugs and then forced her to marry when under the influence of drugs. And then she is obviously raped, but she cannot be said to be raped because she was married under the influence of drugs. So rape is then essentially legal. Marriage is so important and the birth of children is so important that rape could be overlooked or not. If you survive rape, you might not be believed. This is also true in the context of a relationship. So one of the most interesting but also difficult sets of legal cases involve cases in which people have argued that they were raped in the context of a romantic relationship, which could be rape in the context of a marriage, or it could be rape in the context of any romantic relationship that one partner wants to end. In many cases, it is the woman who has said that she has tried to end a relationship with her romantic partner and she is raped. Because marriage and the family are often seen to be natural outgrowths of every heterosexual relationship, one of the then it is often hard for someone to actually make a legal claim. And so what must be really clear is that consent must be given at all times. And the Canadian law is really clear. Unlike India or Pakistan or other countries, and unlike lots of states in the United States of America, Canada has really clear laws. One must consent. So even if you were somebody's husband at a certain time or somebody's boyfriend, this does not mean you have the right to access someone or access consent from someone without permission. So the central objective of Andrea Dworkin's work, which is really famous feminist scholarship, is analyzing society, culture, and politics through the prism of men's sexual violence against women in a patriarchal context. She wrote on a wide range of topics, including the lives of Joan of Arc, Margaret Papandreou, Leo Tolstoy, Marquis de Sade, Kobe Abe, Tennessee Williams, James Baldwin, and Isaac Bashevis Singer. So she documented the lives of really interesting writers, artists, and activists who were either from America or lived in America. She brought her own radical feminist point of view, including fairy tales, homosexuality, lesbianism, virginity, anti-Semitism, the state of Israel, Holocaust, biological superiority, and racism. So Andrea Dworkin's position as a Jewish feminist, I think, is really interesting because from her perspective, this kind of violence against women and male violence and the forcing of women into positions of sexual submission, but also inferiority and the constant degradation of women as being inferior and as being people who can constantly be objectified, called upon to provide sexual services, told that they must change their appearance to gain male attention. All of it has this tone of fascism. So Andrea Dworkin interrogated premises underlying concepts such as freedom of the press and liberties. She theorized the sexual politics of intelligence, fear, courage, and integrity. She described a male supremacist political ideology manifesting in and constituted by rape, battery, prostitution, and pornography. So Andrea Dworkin was really critical of the ways that we already begin from this premise that women's lives are going to involve being harmed by men and somehow enjoying it because that is a central part of being a woman. And even so, then prior to Andrea Dworkin, after Andrea Dworkin started to write, Judith Butler's writings regarding gender also trouble this idea further, that not only are women not people who enjoy being harmed by men or will inevitably be harmed by men, but women don't have to identify as women. So Bill C-16 adds gender identity and gender expression to the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code. So one cannot be discriminated against if they do not want to be named as a woman or as a man, and they don't want to be treated as such. So what is interesting about Andrea Dworkin is that Dworkin also was interested in the ways that class and class antagonism really structures this kind of pornographic gaze. So reducing people's lives to gender and therefore stating that someone could be, I guess, made into a sex object and then objectified and then chosen and objectified and then that a person could then be kind of told that they must be a wife is about a refusal to accept class antagonism. Andrea Dworkin was a very wealthy, successful celebrity. So Andrea Dworkin discussed the refusal to accept that women are raped in the American media. And in this essay, Can a Raped Woman Be Believed? Authors talk about how Dworkin was always critical of the ways that the US media will never believe that women are raped. And this could perhaps be because of the centrality of the family in one's life and the refusal to accept that women have the right to say no to certain sexual relationships and that women do not have to marry by a certain age or at all. Women do not even have to be women. So the narrative was met with widespread public statements of doubt and disbelief, including by many feminist commentators. Andrea Dworkin claimed to be saddened but unsurprised by the reactions. If the Holocaust can be denied even today, she is reported to have said, how can a woman who has been raped be believed? So Dworkin was really interested in fascism and the way that fascism structures not only our ideas of the family and gender, but obviously um, the ways that gender identity and an obsession or a kind of fixation on the family is also about race and racial purity. So if the family and if gender is kind of constructed through the family, then I would argue that the family also upholds these ideas of distinct ethnic communities. So the idea that Indians or we as a certain ethnic community are family oriented has this dual function of upholding racial hierarchy and gendered hierarchy. Sarah Ahmed writes this: if whiteness gains its currency by going unnoticed, what does it mean to notice whiteness? So is whiteness connected to this idea of the family and to religious norms that uphold a certain family ideal? Does the family inevitably end up reproducing structures of caste, race, and class, in privileging certain social actors as good family men and good family people because of their class position? So Andrea Dworkin is interested in the ways that rape narratives are really about the structure of American society and the history of slavery. So for Dworkin, this kind of good white American family who owned slaves and were perhaps kind of secret or not so secret neo-Nazis at different points in American history were family people. And as family people, they could, the kind of casual violence against women and the objectification of the female body, and also the kind of use of racial others as sexual fetishes could never really be discussed. Rape narratives as a form of truth-telling have always been discounted within the North American media. And there have been these high-profile cases like the case of Brock Turner, who is a sports player. And Brock Turner's identity as this white American who can play sports is somehow used to kind of justify his limitless rage against all others, specifically young women of color. So Andrea Dworkin's account, along with other rape narratives, can therefore be seen to sit between two different generic standards of truth-telling: a legal standard with an emphasis on factual truth and external verifiability, and a feminist one with an emphasis on subjective or experiential truth and markers of authenticity. Narrators and readers of these texts must therefore navigate between different and ideologically opposed criteria of believability, making evaluations of texts highly conditional on the normative presumptions the readers bring to them. So when someone says, I was abused or I was raped, and when children say that they were molested or they were abused, do we believe them? It's interesting to think about how our belief changes depending upon our positionality. So feminist theorists like Sandra Harding, whose work I've discussed previously and who has informed theories of Black feminist thought and Black feminist standpoint epistemology, would argue that the ways that we read are about our position. When someone is young and they are not really part of their own family and they can still remember being not necessarily always treated nicely by their family members or by religious authorities, they're much more likely to believe survivors of child abuse, and they're much more likely to believe women who have been abused in the context of marriages. When someone is older and they are invested in the family economy, they're often less likely to believe that people have been abused. So theories of autobiography have emphasized the vulnerability and risks faced by autobiographical narrators as they seek to construct an autobiographical self and have that self have that self-recognized. In narratives of trauma, this vulnerability is enhanced both by the difficulty of telling and the potential for the original trauma to be compounded if a narrative is disbelieved or rejected. So Dworkin and other feminists, like Saidiya Hartman, Amia Srinivasan, who is an Oxford professor, have all written about the relationship between slavery and rape. The rape of women who were outside the slave-owning family was central to slavery in the same way that colonialism often involved married men setting sail and taking sex slaves or forcing women into sexual slavery or taking second wives or sexually harassing and raping women in the colonies. It was central. The kind of economy of slavery included all of these other actors who were not part of the white Christian family, but who could be raped with impunity. In 19th century common law, rape was defined as the forcible carnal knowledge of a female against her will and without her consent. Yet the actual or attempted rape of an enslaved woman was not an offense. Was an offense neither recognized nor legislated by law. Rape was not simply unimaginable because of purported black lasciviousness, but its repression was essential to the displacement of culpability that characterized both the recognition of black humanity in slave law and the designation of the black subject as the originary locus of transgression and offense. The cases of State of Missouri versus Celia and George versus State averred that the enslaved in general and captive women in particular were not appropriate subjects of common law and thus not protected against rape. So it took years for rape law to challenge slavery and firstly, well, it took an extensive amount of time for slavery to be abolished, but it took an extensive amount of litigation and battles before the rape of those who were outside the Christian family, the white Christian family, was taken seriously in law. If the legal existence of the crime of rape depends upon evaluating the mens rea and actus rea of the perpetrator, and more importantly, the consent or non-consent of the victim, then how does one grapple with issues of consent and will when the negation or restricted recognition of these terms determine the meaning of enslavement? I would argue that the American family and the obsession with the American family is and always has been and perhaps always will be about slavery. If the commonplace understanding of will implies the power to control and determine our actions and identifies the expressive capacity of the self-possessed and intending subject, certainly this is far afield of the conditions and terms available to the enslaved. But the notion of the will connotes more than simply the capacity to act and do. Rather, it distinguishes the autonomous agent from the enslaved, encumbered, and restrained. So slavery itself is really about the body and what one can do with their own body to another person's body. It is also about who is and is not a free person. And the family is really also about the same set of issues. What can you do with your body to another person's body, and who is and is not a free person? The history of rape and slavery is also centrally about who can and cannot be accused of rape, as opposed to who can and cannot build a family. So the case of Emmett Till has been discussed extensively by feminists like Amia Srinivasan discusses Emmett Till, and Srinivasan is an Oxford professor who has written about the involuntary celibate movement and the relationship between race and sex and power in the Americas. So Emmett Lewis Till was an African-American boy who was abducted, tortured, and lynched in Mississippi in 1955 at the age of 14, after being accused of offending a white woman, Carolyn Bryant, in her family's grocery store. The brutality of his murder and the acquittal of his killers drew attention to the long history of violent persecution of African Americans in the United States, till posthumously became an icon of the civil rights movement. So Emmett Till could be accused of rape when he looked at this woman in a grocery store, but the predominantly white Christian and Catholic clergy have been accused of sexual abuse of children, and many of these cases are not taken seriously, and people still return to these religious formations. Canada is a great example of this as well. Canada has a long history of Jesuit priests raping Indigenous children, and the kind of disbelief is really about the authority of white men and Christianity and Catholicism over other people's bodies and lives. In the Jim Crow South, Carolyn Bryant's testimony provided justification for what her husband Roy Bryant and her brother J.W. Millam did. Emmett Till was trying to rape her and thus got what he had coming. So Till's mother, whose sense of propriety shines through in the story Lacumba shared about her, had to endure both the loss of her child and the allegation that he was a sexual predator. That part is not true, Carolyn Bryant Donham now says. So she retracted her story. And the case of Emmett Till is the story of this woman who lied. And she did lie in the Jim Crow South because Emmett Till was black. And she lied because these people hated Emmett Till, and they hated him because he was black. They also lied profusely. I mean, this kind of story of pretending that young black men were staring at white women was also a way of trying to steal property and money from black people and from emancipated black people. Andrea Dworkin discusses Holocaust denial and the refusal to accept that the Holocaust happened as another way of denying fascism in the global north. In the quotation that refers to the Holocaust, she refers to herself as a woman who has been raped. This is Andrea Dworkin, and disbelieved, referencing the silencing, erasure, and rewriting of women's accounts of sexual violence that has been well documented by feminists. The reference to the Holocaust extends this process of generalization through an analogy to revisionist historians and their erasure and silencing of the voices and stories of Holocaust survivors. I would argue that the story of rape and the story of family and the story of gender and identity is always about money. The entire history of identity politics is often thought about in terms of feelings and who loves who and who cares about who, but I would argue that at the core, all of this kind of emotion and the language that is used in the endless debates about what children are and who families are and what women do and if it's right or wrong for a woman who's middle class to spend money on a cat or a dog is really about money and who can use other people's money and things and who can use other people's body, other people's money, other people's lives. The analogy both confers the moral legitimacy of victimhood on Dworkin and formulates the act of disbelief as normatively suspect. Her account of the disbelief of others is one in which she has been doubly wronged, both through a direct act of violence and the denial of her account of that violence. It is this second harm that makes the betrayal of her so-called sisters unbearable for Dworkin, emphasizing both that readers have agency around questions of belief and that their judgments are inflected by social norms and relations of power. So Dworkin then opens up this archive of disbelief. And this disbelief of sexual violence during the Holocaust is really about women's investments in racial purity against other women. So what Dworkin argues is that during the Holocaust, many women denied sexual violence against Jewish women, disabled women. And German women who obviously benefited financially from the Third Reich often hid the sexual violence of Nazis against young girls, against children, and against Jewish women, disabled women, queer women, um, the Roma. So during World War II, Jewish men and women in concentration camps faced sexual violence due to wartime discrimination, anti-Semitism, and genocidal conditions, among other reasons. This discrimination happened both inside concentration camps run by Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime and also outside of the camps. The family was a site for Nazi organizing. The building of the Nazi family was central to the exclusion of minorities. It was central to the actual erasure or disappearance of minorities. So organizing oneself in a family and never speaking to strangers, never speaking to ethnic minorities was a way of allowing people or encouraging people or ignoring people's actual internment in camps. So rape was central to Nazism and the Holocaust, and rape involving both Jewish and non-Jewish women, men, and children occurred during the Second World War. Rape occurred in homes, in hiding, in ghettos, in prisons, in brothels, and in concentration camps. German soldiers, guards, SS members, non-German allies and collaborators, and civilians, as well as fellow prisoners, perpetuated these abuses and represented multiple countries. Many were raped by those in positions of authority, including some Jewish women who were raped by collaborators or rescuers, as well as by other Jews. Rape occurred in institutionalized settings such as prisons, as well as informal settings such as homes. Women and men were assaulted in private areas, as is common for rape, as well as usually in public. Forced marriages were also obviously central to Nazism, that young German girls had to play a role in the Third Reich. And they had to marry and they had to have Christian marriages. Some surviving women reported rapes that they had witnessed. Testimonies often mention the event but do not elaborate on them. Memories may be too painful or embarrassing to recall. Society has not readily acknowledged such experience during the Holocaust, and interviewers are reluctant to delve into such personal injuries. Rape is increasingly recognized as a weapon of war, and not only as a spoil of war. Modern genocides, such as those in Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, have clearly incorporated rape into their actions, and rape is increasingly recognized and examined as a part of these wars. As few Holocaust survivors remain to tell their stories, and as even fewer of them will have experienced rape, this aspect of the Holocaust will probably remain unknown. So Robert Brim discusses domestic violence and child abuse in the book. And what Brim argues is that in many instances of domestic violence, women, and specifically women, are never believed, and neither are children. I would argue that one of the reasons that domestic violence, rape, and child sexual abuse continues is because it is women themselves who often uphold the family, and they uphold the family because of economic dependence. So if you look at Brim's research in this chapter, what the author discusses is how the gender pay equity gap is connected to the family, and it is women themselves who often are economically dependent on men. And they begin their lives by being economically dependent on fathers and then move to being economically dependent on husbands. So it is women themselves who don't want to believe domestic violence or rape exists in the family, and it is sometimes it can be women themselves who do not want to believe that their children are being abused. So Andrea Dworkin elicited extreme reactions when she argued that heterosexual sex is often rape. And Andrea Dworkin made many comments that were provocative as a writer in comparing heterosexual sex to rape. And so Dworkin was often written about as being irrational or as being extreme. But Andrea Dworkin was also a really popular feminist writer. Other feminists have argued that domestic violence is often rewritten in the North American media and the global media as romance. Shauna L. Trinch demonstrates in her discussion of the ways in which translation of Latino women's narratives of domestic violence from conversational accounts to legal documents in the form of applications for protective orders requires a series of erasures, substitutions, and reinscriptions. So again, it is about how we read. When Latinas in the United States of America want to leave abusive relationships, the narratives often have to be read and reread again by different people before the claims of abuse are really taken seriously. And what authors have argued is that this is often how we hear these words about domestic violence, rape, child abuse is dependent upon our own investment in a religious family. This risk is particularly pertinent for narrators such as Trinch's subjects, who could be classified as uncognizant of the rules and truth criteria of a genre with which they are engaged. Cognizant narratives, on the other hand, could be defined as narratives who are aware of both the broad cultural doxa and the generic conversations that will be used to evaluate their narratives. So the entire wedding industry, the family industry, the way that the family sounds, how good it makes people feel to be married or say they're married or to have a baby, the photo of the baby, like the photo of the first world baby. I mean, if you were to take photos of lots of babies throughout the world who are perhaps not going to have healthy hearts and who will starve. I mean, this would not really be the same as the first world baby and how good it makes people feel to see this child. And so this kind of emotional narrative often makes it really difficult for women, and specifically ethnic minority women and women from religious ethnic communities, to leave the context of spousal abuse and to get restraining orders. And it also makes people who survive child physical and sexual abuse, it makes it really difficult for these claims to be heard because there is an entire industry and media that really celebrates the family. So I'll finish there because of time. And on Thursday, I'll discuss the idea of believable narratives, and I'll talk about, again, Brim's discussion of the Canadian family and also divorce, and whether or not people, or why people will not necessarily believe that not everyone has a happy family. So I will email you your grades if I haven't posted them yet on Blackboard. I know some people sent me the paper. I'm sorry, it's a bit late. I've responded to the Blackboard submissions, but I will email you your grade. And I'll email you your grade before Thursday. So by next class, you will have it. And that's all. Do you have any questions about the chapters? I think the Brim chapter, this chapter that looks at divorce and child custody and marriage itself, is really interesting in Canada because many people in this time period in Canada, specifically now 2025, majority of people in Canada will try to form some sort of union that could be declared to be a civil union. It can be common law, but there are many parts, especially in parts of urban Canada, where divorce is now quite common. Yes. Any other questions? So you'll have a week. I will give you your grades. Most people, as I said, received 18, 19, or 20 on the first test. So I'm sure you will do well on the second test as well. It will be the same format and the same kind of marking scheme. Thank you. So I'll finish the class there. Thanks. Bye.